Week 6, Lesson 4, Disney Characters. Now, it's time to take a long overdue look at Disney characters. The reason we didn't talk about them before was that there was so much information in the previous weeks that we didn't have a chance to create a video about them that fit in the week's themes. We're going to rectify that right now, because Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck are just as important to the comic book medium as Captain America. Remember, back in the second week's lessons, I mentioned Winsor McCay from Little Nemo fame? Well, Winsor McCay was hugely influential in pioneering the medium of animation, and was one of the main influences for a young artist named Walt Disney. Walt Disney was born in 1901 and died in 1966. During his lifetime, he became one of the most influential people on the planet. He gained fame and success with his cartoon shorts, the most famous of these being Steamboat Willie, a parody of a movie at the time called Steamboat Bill Jr. This short was released in 1928 and had a mouse filling in the role of Bill Jr. This mouse would later go on to become one of the most important vermin in all of fiction. He became known as Mickey Mouse. Mickey Mouse was Walt Disney's most famous creation and later went on to become the symbol of Disney's studio. Now, I usually try my best not to quote Wikipedia, since I try and avoid it if I can and use a number of sources to come to my conclusions, but in this case, they've said everything better than I ever could. So, here we go. Mickey made his first comic strip appearance on January 13th, 1930. The comical plot was credited to Disney himself, art to Ub Iwerks, and inking to Win Smith. The first week or so, the strip featured a loose adaptation of Crazy Plane. Minnie soon became the first addition to the cast. The strip, first released between January 13, 1930 and March 31, 1930, has been occasionally reprinted in comic book form under the collective title Lost on a Desert Island. Animation historian Jim Korkis notes, after the 18th strip, Iwerks left and his inker, Win Smith, continued drawing a gag-a-day format. On April 1, 1930, Mickey entered the first newspaper original comic strip story, not just a bunch of comic gags based around an existing short. This led to an adventure that would retroactively be called Race to Death Valley, and despite having Walt Disney's signature on each of the strips, the actual comic was written by Floyd Gottfredson. Floyd Gottfredson was born in 1905 and died in 1986. When he first started working for Disney, he wanted to be an animator, but Walt Disney put him on the comic strip assignment. It was only supposed to be a temporary assignment, but it lasted over 45 years. The strips usually started with Mickey Mouse on his farm, hearing some news that would lead into a slapstick adventure. In the first real storyline, Race to Death Valley, it's revealed that Minnie Mouse, Mickey's longtime girlfriend, has a rich uncle that left her everything. The shady lawyer wants to trick her out of owning it, and it's up to Mickey to save the day by facing many villains. Of course, all the problems are solved with slapstick action. And I'm going to spoil the end of the first adventure by telling you that it turns out Minnie's uncle is still alive, making most of the journey completely pointless. After the first adventure, Mickey's personality is all over the place. At some points, he's suicidal and spends a few strips trying to kill himself. A few months later, he's shooting suction cup arrows at people, trying to get them to fall in love. At one point, Mickey Mouse won a boxing match and had his picture taken, where writer Floyd Gottfredson did a promotion where if you wrote a letter to an address, you'd get a signed picture from Mickey Mouse. Over 20,000 letters came in, surpassing Walt Disney's expectations, which caused more work than Disney wanted, and prompted him to tell Gottfredson never to do it again. Like other newspaper comics at the time, Mickey's comic was collected in pamphlet form. In 1935, Mickey Mouse had his comic book in pamphlet form, called Mickey Mouse Magazine, which told not only the adventures of Mickey, but those of his friends. Among Mickey's friends were Donald Duck, Goofy, Minnie, Daisy, Clarabelle, and Horsecollar. The most famous of these friends is Donald Duck, who first appeared in a Sunday comic strip on September 16, 1934, called The Little Wise Hen. His first appearance in Gottfredson's daily comic was on February 10, 1935. Donald was originally shown doing daily activities on a farm, until he became the lead star of a Sunday comic called Silly Symphonies. There are two other Disney employees, writer Ted Osborne and artist Al Taliaferro, who turned Donald from a farmer into a city dweller. On October 17, 1937, they also introduced his nephews, the triplets, Huey, Dewey, and Louie. They were the sons of Donald's sister, Della Duck. Now, the Donald in this comic is different than the Donald that we saw in the cartoons, movies, and television shows at the time. This is because Donald started to get a knack for treasure hunting. Donald's first treasure hunt was printed in a comic called 4-Color Issue Number 9 in 1942. It was entitled Donald Duck Finds Pirate Gold, and the original writer and artists are unknown. However, it's speculated that an artist called Carl Barks helped edit this story in some way. Who is Carl Barks? Well, he's not especially well known in America, but in Europe, he's more famous. There are those that would argue that he was one of the most influential storytellers of the 20th century. Carl Barks was born in 1901 and died in 2000. He was born in Oregon, and there really wasn't much of interest in his early life. At least not for the purposes of this course. He drew for fun, and then tried to do it professionally. He hit his big break when he began working for Disney, and his work on Donald Duck is what made the character one of the most successful ones in the history of comics. Barks' version of Donald had more control over his temper. He made Donald speak in a way that was easy to understand. He took Donald away from Mickey and Goofy and had him inherit the fictional town of Duckburg. Most of Donald's comics were about him trying to take care of his nephews, and the nephews would learn life lessons in the process. The comics were well received, but where Barks really began to make his mark was with a Donald adventure called Christmas on Bear Mountain. In this story, Donald gets an invitation from his eccentric but rich uncle to spend the holiday at the cabin. His uncle Scrooge is concerned that his nephew Donald is a wimp and cowardly. So, Scrooge disguises himself as a bear to prove how brave Donald is. Things became complicated when a real bear gets into the cabin, and comedy ensues. So, despite being introduced as an antagonist for Donald, Scrooge was popular enough with both fans and his creator to get his own comics. Scrooge McDuck, or Uncle Scrooge, he's known by both names, became one of Disney's most famous characters. Where most of Donald Duck's stories involved him living in a relatable day-to-day lifestyle where things just went out of control in a comedic over-the-top slapstick fashion, Scrooge's stories were of him trying to keep his money from being robbed and going on adventures to find valuable treasures to add to his collection. Scrooge dealt with giant robots, Norse and Greek gods, and went searching for treasures of historical figures like Marco Polo or Genghis Khan. They were a hit with both adults and children. Carl Barks' name was supposed to be anonymous, but his drawings were better than the other artists drawing the comic, and he became known as the Good Duck Artist. Eventually, some fans tracked him down and were able to confirm that he drew the comics. This caused people to begin to know his name, and his reputation grew. As successful as Donald and Scrooge were in the United States, they were also incredibly popular in the Scandinavian countries, especially Norway. While the characters were part of a genre known as funny animal comics, the quality seen in Carl Barks' work went above anything else that was being done in that genre at the time. Scrooge is still counted on Forbes' annual Richest Fictional Characters list, and he's one of the main inspirations for the movie character Indiana Jones. Although no direct link was ever proven, Carl Barks' style of drawing was very similar to Astro Boy's and early manga cultures. And the first ever image on a Macintosh computer was the image of Scrooge McDuck. Donald Duck is one of the most popular comic book characters in history, appearing in more comics than almost everyone but Superman, Batman, Spider-Man, and Wolverine. The one last thing I'll mention about Disney Comics was that they never carried the Comic Code Authority's stamp of approval, and yet were still sold in newsstands. The reason for this is that Disney didn't make crime or horror comics, but the other, more important reason is that Disney had its own set of rules for writers and artists to follow that was even stricter than the comic codes. Because Walt Disney became such a powerful force in entertainment, No one working on the Association of Comic Magazine publisher dare challenge him. So why are Mickey Mouse and the Duck comics so important to our course? Because they are great examples of funny animal comics, comics adapted from animated source material, and comics that truly target all ages, not just children. They also help showcase that Disney is a significant player in the comics market and has been that way since the early 1940s. The comics were used to try new things with the characters and add aspects to them not seen in the cartoons. Donald Duck got an extended family from this, and those characters became successful in their own right. Questions to contemplate. Can you think of any other funny animal characters that star in comics? What other reasons could you think of why Carl Barks was so much more popular than his Disney co-workers?